Good evening and welcome to the latest in our Ecclesiastical Bite-Size series. This evening we're going to be thinking about ordination and the law around it, and I'm joined by Raymond, Raymond, why don't you introduce yourself and therefore why you are the one we've asked to talk about this topic?
Thank you. Yes, it's lovely to be here. I've got one of the longest job titles, certainly in the Diocese of Southwark, and let me get this right, because I always have to think about it, the Assistant Diocesan Director of Ordinands and Deputy Director of Vocations in the Diocese of Southwark. In effect, I will help oversee the selection process for those coming forward for selection for training for ordination. And I also studied on the Cardiff LLM, and my dissertation looked at effectively the law as it relates to ordination. So I think that's why I've been invited here, Moira.
That sounds a very good reason why we might have asked you for this one. So, what is ordination?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and probably has a couple of ways we can look at it, and not to go into too much depth, because our time's short. But I mean, on one hand, there's the theological question, and I think whenever we talk about ecclesiastical law, canon law, I think for me personally, it's really important not to lose sight of the theological context within which the legal questions that we're grappling with, the context in which these sit. And of course, Church of England, there's plenty of traditions within the church. For some people, ordination is simply a setting apart of a leader within the community. For other people, it is an ontological change. It has much more sacramental effect. Let's not get into all of that tonight. On the other hand, there is the recognized orders in the Church of England of deacon, priest, and bishop. And being ordained is entering into one of those orders.
I'm just trying to watch. Where's your headphones?
If you could go to mute, please. So, who can get ordained if it's getting you to be a deacon, priest, or bishop? Who can be ordained?
Yeah, that's kind of where we start off with this, I would say. And so often the case with ecclesiastical law questions, is it even an ecclesiastical law seminar if we don't bring Mark Hill in on this? And I'm going to start with a quote from him, from the fourth edition of his Ecclesiastical Law book. What he says is that providing the canonical requirements are met, a bishop has an absolute discretion as to whom he or she ordains. And I think that's an interesting question there about discretion. On one hand, a bishop really does have discretion as to who he or she ordains. And that can even, this is where I slightly disagree with Mark, is that it can actually be outside the, as he says, canonical requirements. But that then raises the question of what makes an ordination legal, lawful, and also what makes it valid. So they'll come on to the legal requirements in a minute, but if an ordination is done outside the lawful legal requirements, then it doesn't necessarily mean it's not valid. So you can have a valid ordination, which is not necessarily lawful. So what you can have is that all legal ordinations are valid, but not all valid ordinations are legal. I'll leave that there. I think that might raise some questions later on.
So then, what makes an ordination legal then?
Well, there's lots of ways, lots of things that need to be met, I guess, to make it legal, and the different sources of that law. The first is the canons. that's really the main source of law when it comes to ordinations, I would suggest. There's also some legal requirements in the ordinal, and then there's also the regulations, whether they're at national church level, diocesan level, whatever. I'm not really going to draw on the civil law, secular law, because I don't think that has too much bearing on this. The Canon C1 is where I want to start. And that states that no one shall be accounted or take to be a lawful bishop, priest, or deacon in the Church of England, or suffer to execute any of the said offices, except that they be called, tried, examined, and admitted thereunto according to the ordinal or any form of service, alternative thereto, and so on. And then the other canons deal with other requirements. Canon C1 goes on to talk about general considerations. There's a requirement that ordinations take place either at Petertide, Michaelmas, or around St. Thomas's Day, that they take place in a cathedral. And what I would say is that this is the interesting thing to me, is that there are these requirements and very few of them have any sanctions attached to them. So yeah, we should be ordaining people on or around the feast of St. Peter, Michaelmas, or St. Thomas, but we know that of ordinations that happen at different times and not exactly within those parameters, and certainly ordinations happen not necessarily in cathedrals either, particularly priestly ordinations. So you have these requirements, but sometimes they're observed in the breach rather than actually being met. There's another requirement that anybody who's taking part in an ordination service should lay on hands. And when I was reminding myself of this, Moira, I remembered an ordination that you and I went to, where we were, as you as Archdeacon, me taking the DDO role in that presentation part of the service. And we were specifically asked not to lay on hands. And so the question I asked myself is, was that contrary to the canons? Did we actually have an obligation under canon law to lay on hands? But the question is, were we taking part in the service? Because the requirement is, if you're taking part in the service, you are required to lay on hands. But if you're not laying on hands, are you taking part in the service? I think that's a question to which there probably really isn't an answer. It'd be interesting to know whether you felt you were taking part in that service or not.
I was certainly taking the archidiaconal role of presenting to the bishop and confirming that they'd had the appropriate training, as is my right, although we do sometimes delegate that to DDOs. But on that occasion, in that particular situation, I felt it was actually important that I was there holding the archidiaconal role and not being pushed out of it, shall we say. So, yes.
So yes, you were taking part in the service. So then maybe there was a canon law obligation, I don't know, to lay on hands there.
And other simple things in the canons which we can talk about age, gender, whether being baptized, those sort of things that are relevant.
Yes, no, absolutely. Age, the norm is to be deaconed at not less than 23 years of age and priesthood a year later. And there's a very definite reason for that that's stated, which is to allow a period of trial before somebody occupies that order of that priestly order. That can be changed by faculty. The Archbishop of Canterbury can grant a faculty to reduce the age of being deaconed below 23. Similarly, the age of being priested can be reduced by the Archbishop's faculty, but only by a year. So nobody can be deaconed legally under the age of 23. Gender is fairly settled now in the Church of England, that all three orders are open to men and women. And then there's also a requirement to be baptized, which I think is fairly basic, but there's an interesting case actually in the Roman Catholic Church, and I suspect it probably would transfer over to Church of England as well, where a Roman Catholic priest was not validly baptized. And this came to light because the baptism was done in the 1990s, where there was a video camera recording the baptism, and the priest baptized the baby by saying, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." And so that was held not to be a valid baptism. And then the knock-on effect of that was he wasn't validly baptized, therefore not validly confirmed, therefore not validly ordained. It caused all sorts of problems. I wonder what would happen in the Church of England if we encountered that issue. I think there's an interesting theological question there. There's also a requirement around capacity. So there's a disability and ability question here, where in the Canon C4.3 talks about a candidate being physically and mentally able to carry on their duties, and that's determined in the opinion of the bishop. But there's clearly huge issues there around disability legislation under the Equality Act. I'm not going to go into all of that just now, but I think that's an interesting intersection between the bishop's obligations and rights and discretion, and what the bishop's duties are under the equality legislation, where there isn't a carve out in relation to disability.
There's also something about Canon C4 faculties that I hear about from time to time. What's that about?
Yes, it's a thorny issue. And a bit complicated, very broadly, if you've been divorced and you're remarried and your previous spouse is still alive, then there is a bar to you being ordained. That bar can be lifted by the relevant archbishop granting a faculty after an investigation has taken place. The bar to be met in relation to removing the inability to be ordained, granting the faculty, is around scandal. Would there be any scandal in that Greek word, the scandalon, of that person being ordained? It gets slightly more complicated, because if the candidate for ordination is divorced and remarried, if it's their first marriage, yet their spouse has previously been married, and that's their remarriage, and their first spouse is still alive, then the faculty also needs to be granted. This only applies to same-sex marriage. It doesn't apply to civil partnerships. And obviously, if somebody's in a same-sex marriage, whether it's their first, their second, or whatever, they as it stands at the moment, they're not able to be ordained either. I would also mention the great crime provision, which is in the Ordinals. So similar to the Canon C4 faculty, if somebody has committed a great crime, a dispensation would need to be granted by only the Archbishop of Canterbury in that case. And there's a very specific definition of what constitutes a great crime. But as you can imagine, it's serious offences.
Yeah. So those are the legal bits, but in practice, I don't just go, "Oh, I think this Michaelmas, I shall ordain some people. Come on, people, you're over 23, let me ordain you."
Yeah, no, I'm glad I'm glad that you're not such a loose cannon as that. Yeah, there's obviously a national church process, and that was changed a few years ago. We now have a two-stage process of interviewing and selection, which begins in the diocese, but the national church process interviews candidates on an interim basis, and then there's a final selection panel where a recommendation, and it's only a recommendation, is made to the sponsoring bishop as to whether that person, and it's not whether they should be ordained, but whether they should be admitted to training for ordination. It's only during that training for ordination that a further recommendation is made as to whether that person be ordained or not. But what I would say around the national church selection process is that the legalities that we're talking about, particularly around the status of the individual, so age, marital status, that sort of thing, safeguarding issues as well. If those would prevent somebody from being ordained, then actually they would prevent them, by and large, from going to a stage 2 selection panel. So that's really where that softer, more regulatory aspect intersects with the hard legal aspects of the surrounding ordination.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond. It's been really good to have this conversation with you. And we'll draw this to a close now.